piling on, and it's very hard for me to introduce the speaker because his resume, if I had asked him for it, I didn't even bother because I'm sure that it must be at least 20 pages by now. He's so well published, and he's been so active in the art world for many years. He has a degree from Yale undergraduate. He has a PhD from Penn. His first job teaching was at Hopkins, but he's also been curator, senior curator at a number of very well-recognized institutions, including the National Gallery of Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and the Kimball Art Museum, which is where I encountered him when I was a baby curator with training wheels on. And he was a major inspiration for me in my career, and I really aspired to be like him because he has one of the most brilliant and retentive minds that I've ever encountered. And in our field, it's something of a minor miracle when you meet someone who's got an eye and a memory so that the scholarship rolls so effortlessly through him. And it is a type of knowledge that doesn't really exist very frequently anymore. So we're really very honored to have him here. And he was even kind enough to embrace the possibility of concluding the lecture series with a new topic. And so I'm really very eager to see what he's come up with. I should also mention that he's very active right now as one of the foremost specialists of a number of artists for whom he is directing the catalogue Raisonné, which is, sort of a revived dinosaur, hopefully, now that we have all these issues of attribution. But he's working actively on Tanguy, but also on Dali, and he's also now been invited to work also on the catalogue Raisonné of Monet. And we were just reminiscing about the Monet show back at the Art Institute that he did, and in fact it had set record-breaking attendance, and we remember it fondly as being one of the first blockbusters, sort of for better or worse, of museum culture. And so it is with great pleasure that I invite you to welcome Charlie Stuckey to the stage.
Well, thank you so much. Good morning.
Good morning.
I don't have very much to say about any of these slides, so they should go fast. That's the idea. Oh, here's the little clicker. See, I've got this right. When Ike asked me to come and speak about, sort of contemporary art, I begged off and said I don't really follow it anymore. I don't know much about it, and often I'm not that interested in it. And as I tried to squirm out of saying yes, it became clearer and clearer to me that this was an opportunity to get off of my chest a kind of ongoing complaint that over the decades had amused and amazed me, which had to do with works of art that consist of a lot of the same things sort of piled together. And I was spurred to do it by the recent release of this wonderful film, The Square. La Place is the European title for it, that won the 2017 Best Film at the Cannes Film Festival. It features this sort of heartthrob Claes Borg as a curator of a contemporary art museum in some Scandinavian capital. And I'm showing you here a still where Elizabeth Moss, who I'm sure you're all more familiar with, appears to confront him about a fling they had together. And while she is badgering him to see whether he can remember her name, in the background is one of the works of art on display at the museum, which of course is a huge pile of chairs. And because of its instability, while they're having their sort of tense conversation, you hear little creaking sounds as if the chairs could all come, collapsing down any minute. And the film is so spot on, it seemed to me, about museums today, although I don't think that's not what the film is about, really. It's just set in one. But when the more I thought about this pile of chairs, I I thought, I've seen so many piles of chairs in my life, and what am I to think of that? I mean, I'm thrilled that during the course of my professional career, there's been such an expansion of artists worldwide. I mean, there are so many artists at work today everywhere that it's obvious to me that there's going to be more repetition than we've ever had before. But it also strikes me as strange that that sort of artists who have a certain stature and have certain opportunities, such as representing their countries at the various biennales and art fairs that seem to be everywhere all the time, would take it upon themselves, like the Japanese conceptual artist Kawamata, to do something which had so many immediate antecedents. I mean, it's sort of postmodernism gone a little soggy. Besides this piece in Abu Dhabi, one can't ignore the piece that Ai Weiwei presented at the Venice Biennale of stools, not chairs, but close enough for me. And then we have, of course, Dara Salcedo, the great Colombian artist who in Istanbul recreated a chair accumulation that she had done some 10 years before. We'll get to that later. I want to go chronologically, but I thought I should start where we are right now so that one could have an idea of where we were trying to go before we started out. For someone my age, the great chair accumulation was installed at the Museum of Modern Art in 1968 by Robert Rauschenberg, which was, a complicated affair. They're not physical chairs, they're photographs of a chair that are illuminated when people in the gallery make various noises, thanks to a feedback loop connecting microphones and light switches. That's in Germany today, but it's much closer to the heyday and the outset of accumulation as a brand new mode of art that that's had an appeal that, as I step back from it, is just flabbergasting to think that that the art establishment would embrace it so often and for such a long period of time. I told Ike this morning, I said, doing a quick overview of accumulations in the last 50 or 60 years would be as if I were going to show you all the paintings from the last 50 years that had stripes. This is in Melbourne. This again is a very recent biennale work, triennale, excuse me, at the National Gallery of Victoria by Ron Muick, who filled the gallery up with these human skulls. It's a very impressive image and experience to come upon. It's just that it belongs to a group of experiences that's anything but unique. At the art fair in Basel last year, Subodh Gupta, the Indian artist who specializes in accumulations of various kind of kitchenware from the subcontinent, heaped together thousands of pots and pans to create the decor for a special restaurant, which of course was part of the interactive piece in Basel, but a suspect for what I'm talking about. I suppose nothing was more sublime. I mean, all of them all of these pieces, it seems to me, are reaching for a kind of sublimity in our 21st century world, as the Parthenon of banned books that was erected at Documenta in Kassel in 2014 by the Argentinian artist Menuhin, who again had done this piece earlier, but was invited to sort of recreate it at an expanded scale. The idea being that this would be, an image of freedom of thought that would draw attention. The books that she collected were donated by people. In other words, she ran ads saying, I'm going to do this huge piece, and so any of you that have copies of books that were banned, please send them in. And she put the books in plastic bags, and then, in this case, arranged the plastic bags to become a full-scale replica of the Parthenon before it was sunk into ruins. One of my favorites has to do with the Cuban Collaborative La Carpinteros, who created this room that looks as if somebody took a couple of baskets of tomatoes and threw them everywhere. So it counts to me as an accumulation, and it counts to me as something I hope for, which is accumulations that show a little irony or mockery to the genre in which they are participating. There's a certain kind of awareness always in the work of this group. Last week, this particular sculpture by Jeff Koons, the Play-Doh, which is a pretty monumental sculpture, sold at Christie's for $20 million. I believe there's 5 of them, and they're colored slightly differently. And I think one of the others is now on display at the Getty in Malibu as not that they own it for their collection, but there is in other words, a sort of prominence for work of this sort that strikes me should be something of amazement to us all. Now, Koons, who is always very, very conceptually chic, this is not a pile. This is actually, like the work by Los Carpinteros, an image of a pile. This is a very sort of complicated metal structure that's been, spray painted to look as if it were a gigantic pile of Play-Doh. And again, it seems to me to be a kind of a grand monumental mockery of one of the most important strains of modern art since World War II. It seemed to me that you could pretty much pinpoint when this began and where. And I would say that it began in 1960 and it began in Paris. And it caught on with a kind of wildfire speed, so that early into the 1960s, it was as if there wasn't any artist coming to public attention that didn't work somehow or other in accumulations. The French artist Arman, one of the new realist group, actually used the term accumulation, which I think is probably that's the proper term for the genre that we're talking about this morning. There's a few examples of early accumulations by Arman, whose best friend, Yves Klein, was at the same time also involved with accumulation art. In his case, he did it with sponges, did a series of paintings and large murals that had to do with collecting together lots of sponges and letting them absorb pigment. And Yves Klein's brother-in-law, Gunther Ecker, a German artist, simultaneously developed a mode of working where he drove hundreds and thousands of nails into various canvases and pieces of furniture as his sort of hallmark mode of art making. And all of this, as you can see from the captions, was rather quickly collected by museums of contemporary art in competition with one another for these new works at a time when they were not completely unprecedented, but nearly so. Trying to figure out why this all started, it seemed that the most likely reason would have to do with the Holocaust, would have to do with the shocking images from Auschwitz and Belsen that showed piles of eyeglasses and hair and shoes. They were, of course, widely published in magazines all over the world, but in 1955 in France, they were also celebrated in this famous film by Alain Resnais of Nuit et Brouillard. And this pile of shoes is one of many stills from that film that shows piles and endows them with a certain kind of numb tragedy that I think is often the impetus or the motivation for artists even today who continue with the genre, although they may not be completely aware of any connection. I thought I was going too far when I started wandering into film history, but it's true that in the 50s you start to see a lot of images. This is an early Stanley Kubrick film where the climax of it is a fight to the death in a mannequin warehouse, where that same kind of accumulation feeling is suddenly posited as a new and moving image around this moment. So the question is, if I'm not completely right about the impetus of the Holocaust photographs on this new departure, where else does it come from? And this is not going to take long because there aren't very many of them. But the kind of earliest record that I could come up with visually is from Trajan's column in Rome, which shows what evidently was a common form of battlefield memorial, where the victorious army would take the arms from the defeated foe, and pile them as a trophy, and these would be put on a public display for political and propaganda purposes. But they enter into ancient art that way, and then inevitably, when one thinks of piles and just in generally what it means to see a pile of something, you wonder what Freud and Jung and the other investigators of our deepest subconscious motivations how they might connect the fascination with piles to somehow modes of thought. So I'm just showing you one of these 5 and 10 cent store figures from Catalonia that have been popular for hundreds and hundreds of years, that show characters making a pile of turds. They're usually included in nativity scenes in Catalonia, but they too would be sort of an ancient prototype, if you like. Every now and then in Old Master art, we get a pile image in still life. This etching by Battista Franco is particularly relevant to the remarks this morning because the pileness of it is so intense and focused. And it's a reminder as well that that even before the concentration camps and the Holocaust, there was an association of piles and death and memorial that somehow lingers deep in our collective unconscious. I put this Stuckey still life in from the museum in Strasbourg only because it was so transformative to me when I saw these paintings where the artist on many occasions would just pile glasses into a basket and have that be his still life motif. But that's less important, I think, than the ubiquity of piles that more people would be familiar with. There are obviously a lot of cannonball piles associated with military cemeteries and monuments all over the world. Another sort of favorite pile image that plays into that same tune by the Russian artist Vershagin, The Apotheosis of War. But you can see I've just managed to cover, nearly 2,000 years in about 10 slides. It's not easy to find images of this sort until you come to the Dada period right after World War I, when a lot of young artists internationally wanted to poke as much fun as they possibly could at the conventions of the powers in B that had brought them to the horrible slaughter that World War I represented and its aftermath. I think that probably the prize for being first goes to the Philadelphia artist Man Ray, who at this point was rather best friends with the influential French artist Marcel Duchamp. He decided to fill sort of an olive jar with ball bearings in 1920. He decided to take a bunch of coat hangers and turn them into what he referred to as an obstruction. And seemingly, in this case, even influenced Duchamp, who the following year made one of his famous nonsensical Dada sculptures, which consisted of a bird cage filled with marble, little pieces of marble about the size of sugar cubes. Otherwise, precedents are tough, and I'm not surprised that I would find them in the early works of, for my money, two of the towering figures of the late 20th century. Louise Bourgeois, who began to make sort of modular totems in the early 1950s. She did 5 or 10 of these, and Robert Rauschenberg, whose dirt paintings are incipient piles, and which initiated something that's like another complaint that I'm going to make as I go along, which is art that has to be located on the floor. I could have given a lecture on that as a genre, because it annoys me at least as much as piles, because if you tried to hang it on the wall, of course, the dirt would fall off. I mean, since then, since the early 1950s, God knows, as you'll see, there are artists working with glue and strings and stuff who've been able to get piles off the floor. You'll see plenty of those. But at this early stage, it seems to me they're the operative prototypes for the pile craze that begins around 1960. One of my favorite images, of course, is the blockage in Paris of the Rue Visconti that Christo arranged in 1961 with a bunch of empty oil drums, which is still on his mind. I mean, the proposal to make a pile of empty oil drums in the desert, the size of one of the Egyptian pyramids, remains one of his unfulfilled projects. And to judge from news reports, it could still just happen. But to go back to 1960 and just to run through some of these, because they appear in surveys of art of the period as kind of heroic images that show a new direction that had never been taken before. This is the great performance and environment artist Alan Capro in the back of Martha Jackson's gallery in New York, contributing his work to a group exhibition, which is a pile of old tires entitled Yard. I suppose the most fanatical of all the pile artists that congregated in New York in the first years of the 1960s would be Yayoi Kusama, who's become something of a worldwide celebrity in the last 10 years. But her art has always been very, very heavy in terms of the accumulation principle and the sort of obvious craziness involved in making a pile, which I think is one of the beauties and appeals for us, strangely enough. It's like a welcoming of some kind of hyper-neurosis. Here's this chair that she made by covering it with little sort of phallic size cloth objects that she sewed together and stuffed with sand that the Museum of Modern Art has. It's interesting that when she moved to New York, she moved into the building where Donald Judd lived. And Donald Judd, who was a critic at the time, one of his first activities actually as an artist was helping her make the little units, the modules, if you like, that she used for these early works. I'll show a couple of slides of her work from the mid-60s because I think they're so amazing, and because they're still with us. I mean, these now museums hanker to have a Kusama show and to get one of her infinity rooms, which were first presented in New York in the mid-1960s, because they bring lines of people to the galleries or museums comparable to a show of, Van Gogh or Picasso or Matisse. Here she is at the Venice Biennale in 1966, surrounded by, hundreds of these polished spheres. And here's a recreation of it 40 years later at a retrospective exhibition of her work that was presented in Berlin a dozen years ago. One of the best known of all these works, I suppose, in terms of the number of times it's been reproduced in surveys of modern art, is the exhibition at the Stable Gallery in New York in 1964 by Andy Warhol, who had produced with his associates and colleagues a multitude of facsimiles of grocery store warehouse boxes for Campbell's soup and Brillo and whatnot, and then filled the whole room as if the art gallery had been transformed into some kind of inventory space. There's a lot of political thinkers, I think, can have a field day with piles as a motif, because the whole notion of creating inventories and then distributing them. These works were, after all, available for purchase separately. You didn't have to buy the whole pile, you could just get one, but the presentation was a pile, is absolutely fundamental to international capitalism, whether it's domestic or international. To this day, I live across the street from one of the pioneers of minimal art in the 1960s, a man called William Anastasi, who I've now known for close to 40 years. And during that period of time, it's been amazing to me how often he's wanted to make sure that I understood that it was him rather than his friend Carl Andre who was the first person to make a stack of bricks. I have in my apartment a little bronze edition that he made a few years ago to try to drive that point home to an audience that wants to ignore it because Andre used the motif over and over again and has kind of, I think, the claim to authorship for most historians by this point. Now, you'll notice that not all of the piles I'm showing you are messy piles. I mean, you can have piles that are like crowds, like some of those Arman accumulations, and then you can have piles that are more like armies that are lined up, like the minimal artists do. But if you think about it, they on a fundamental level, it's the same idea of creating a whole out of the obvious repetition of parts. There's I'd be remiss not to bring Claes Oldenburg in. He wasn't really a pile artist that often, but every now and then he would throw a pile into the mix, I guess, to keep up with his neighbors in New York. I like the green beans a lot, from 1964. It's a European virus to begin with, so the Belgian artist Marcel Bruters, with his entry into the art world in the mid-1960s, very much starts off as an accumulation artist, standing on the shoulders of his fellow Europeans, Arman and Ecker and Yves Klein, with works of art that tended to accumulate eggshells or mussel shells into various manifestations. Again, as you can see from the labels, these are very much museum pieces and considered to be maybe minor milestones, but minor milestones nonetheless in the evolution of contemporary art after World War II. Robert Morris, who was in the same building with Anastasi back in those days in downtown New York, he gets very, very involved with pile art in the late 1960s, most dramatically, and I think memorably. What you're most likely to run into in a major museum collection today will be one of his so-called felt pieces, where enormous pieces of felt are draped from the wall and arranged on the floor in what to me is just another manifestation of the pile aesthetic. Then there are the light bulb sculptures of Dan Flavin. And that might be a stretch, but they are nevertheless, they are about accumulation. One of the most unforgettable days of my early art career was to go to a warehouse that had been created on Franklin Street for Flavin, which was surrounded by bins. This is a real industrial-sized room that we were in, and the bins were filled up with these light bulbs, the idea being that the light bulbs might burn out and that owners would need new ones, and that the artist and his supporters would have to accumulate the parts so that they could continue to glow for as long as there would be life on the planet. We had this wonderful piece in Chicago, which I was never able to show while I was the curator there, by Raphael Soto, the South American artist resident in Paris. I'm leaving out some of the South Americans who were in Paris with Arman and Ecker and Klein and Christo, because there's too many of them really to incorporate. In this case, Soto got thousands of long rods and filled the room with them, so the experience of this particular work of art is penetrating through this pile, if you like, or suspended pile of similar objects, very much in a 60s mode that now starts to appear everything. Eva Hesse, who made such beautiful sculptures in the late 1960s. I mean, the shapes and the surfaces in them are so exquisitely manipulated that they take your breath away. And yet, over and over again, fundamentally, her design idea is to take the same thing and put a lot of them together, which seems to, like gravity, to connect her inevitably to the works of all of her contemporaries in New York and in Europe at the same time. Louise Bourgeois did not do piles constantly, and I sometimes wonder whether a series of sculptures that she made in the late 60s, like Cumul here, might not simply have been inspired by the fact that suddenly she saw so many people doing things that she had done so long ago and thought, wait a second, maybe I should, show people that I know what's going on with piles as well. So she carved piles, again, trompe l'oeil piles rather than actual piles in marble that are exquisite works of art. I must say that as I complain about piles in art, that's some of the works that I'm showing you, I'm absolutely a sucker for. I mean, from the first time I saw them and still, I just find them to be magnificent as works of art. My complaints about the genre as a whole notwithstanding. Here's some more Eva Hesse pieces on display at museums all over the world, and works by her friend Robert Smithson, who of course was able to initiate his very, very influential work as an earth artist by bringing samples of earth into a gallery setting. I mean, that was kind of the first step on his road to spiral jetties. And these non-site pieces with these boxes filled with stones, or these mirror pieces on the floor, for everything else that they are and all the dizzying perspective and concept behind them, are nevertheless just more piles from the 1960s. But the image of the dirt on the floor supporting these double-sided mirrors brings me to one of my complaints about floor art. I bought a piece like this for the Art Institute when I was there, and of course it was a terrible problem, because to put it on display meant that you were endangering the people who were at the museum, not to mention the work of art. So the only way to show it really was to put sort of like a little fence around it, or put it on some kind of a raised platform, which in a way disturbed the concept of just putting it on the floor. I was horrified to learn that after I left the museum, indeed that happened, and someone tripped on the piece and broke it, and I think broke their arm as well at the same time. But it wasn't, the pile per se is not necessarily a museum-friendly genre, and that should make us all the more amazed by the persistence and ubiquity of piles as part of our shared visual culture. Joseph Boyce, unlike Robert Morris, didn't, take the felt and tear it into ribbons and for display, but instead for his so-called phones, his batteries, would just take sheets of felt and stack them almost like gigantic piles of computer paper, and set up a genre of display, which he repeated over and again throughout his career. One of my favorite categories here is Dieter Roth's spice cabinets, which he made around 1970. I think this is the one from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, but it's hard to tell one from the other. But the spice has been taken out of the containers and emptied into the closet, and God forbid you open the door because you'll have a spice-a-lanch. In the news more recently was, of course, because this is the anniversary, I think, of the feminist art program at Cal Arts, which in its infancy had a exhibition space for the female students, and one of the most celebrated pieces from those early political days was Judy Chicago's garbage can filled up with used tampons. That's the end of the first part. Okay, escape. And is that right? F5. F5. Let me see here. There we go. How am I doing here? F5. Yeah, you're right. I needed.
You want to go back to the beginning slide?
Oh yeah, go back to the beginning.
Is that it?
Yes, yes. This is the Polish sculptor Alina, I can't even pronounce her last name, who's received an awful lot of international attention in the last 5 years as kind of an outlier. It's interesting to see that these works, which were unknown to most observers who weren't traipsing through Poland to stay au courant, nevertheless was very much herself in touch with the mode of accumulation art that was prevalent in Western Europe. Here in California, you have your own piles. Robert Arneson, the ceramic artist, got in the act with these fragments of Western civilization, which is, I suppose, some kind of a response to Andre and Anastasi making piles of bricks. And so Arneson would then, use the ceramic medium, which is, of course, fundamental to brick making, to turn it into a ruined pile of them. I'm not going to really get into it because, as you know, there's no time. But one could find in paintings, rather than in sculpture, some counterparts to the pile motif. I mean, to me, Philip Guston's are the most familiar, where, especially in the 1970s, over and again he would treat these nightmarish piles of feet and shoes, which I think in his case are definitely images that are triggered by his memories of the Holocaust, and they become, in a way, variations. These things like Monument at the Tate on another basic issue that I'm not going to talk about, which is the grid painting, which goes hand in hand with the pile. It's kind of the two-dimensional version of the pile, if you like. But just as a quick reminder, there's an image of a $40 million Warhol dollar bill painting and a, I guess, equally expensive Jasper Johns alphabet painting, which shows that there was, in fact, some kind of a connection and sensitivity between the people making sculpture starting around 1960 and the people expressing themselves in two dimensions. Magdalena Abakanowicz, these are some of her earlier works. She was a great fabric artist throughout the 1960s, and as she was invited to teach and exhibit in this country, more and more her hallmark mode became the creation of figures or partial figures that were installed together in groups like the ones here on the screen. You might imagine, you'd be right to think that in some quarters, piles were not welcome, that there were, for example, museums that wanted to get on board with pile art who found that a significant number of their patrons were horrified. So Carl Andre, when invited to do a public sculpture in Hartford and installing a field of boulders, raised a considerable ruckus at the time. I mean, they're still there, but they've never been particularly beloved or understood as new public monuments. But I'll have a couple more examples of that kind of poor reception coming in. When I lived in New York in the early 1980s, I don't think anybody who came to visit me, I dragged them to the Earth Room of Walter de Maria, which had been established on Worcester Street by the Dia Foundation, where you just walked into a room that was completely filled with dirt, because I felt it was just so startling, and there is a kind of sublimity to de Maria's output overall. But then, what do we do about the fact that he is fundamentally a pile artist, whether he's showing a pile of bronze rods at the floor as a broken kilometer, or a pile of poles in a field to attract lightning in New Mexico? They nevertheless belong to, here's the broken kilometer. They belong to this dynamic that it seems to me is so undiscussed. It's something that doesn't come up. I remember when Sotheby's sold the Koons Play-Doh last week, for example, they had an elaborate catalog with maybe 20 or 30 pages showing works by other artists that were similar to it, that would root it in various kinds of traditions. Not one of them was a pile. And brings back memories. Again, now the pile plus glue or string initiates a number of icons from the art of the 70s and 80s and 90s. I showed Dawn here just as a, an example that almost at random, there was a beautiful picture on the internet of the sort of plate paintings made by Julian Schnabel and shown at the Mary Boone Gallery. Simultaneously, coming from London, Richard Long, the conceptual minimalist artist, began to amaze art audiences with various constructions that he made from piles of stone, arranged as rectangles or circles or one thing or another, as a hallmark mode of his display. You can, I hope by now, sort of feel a sense that art students or artists coming out of school immediately wanted to jump in this pool. I have an idea. This is a pile that no one's ever thought of before. One of them would certainly be Alan McCullum, who became, I suppose, one of the most amazing pile artists in the early 80s. Here's a pile of all black framed sort of painting objects that he made over and over again for display. Here's Boyce again at Documenta in Kassel. This was his famous installation of 7,000 trees. What he did is he had ordered 7,000 blocks of stone from somewhere in Ireland to be heaped in front of the museum in Kassel, and then the idea was that as these were taken away from the pile, the owner of each one would plant a tree next to the stone. And you can see these trees and stones all over the world. We have a ton of them in New York, but they start out as a pile to deconstruct. There's piles on every scale. I mean, when you think of Boyce's pile outside of Documenta there, it's vast. But Wolfgang Leib, his countryman, is making piles of pollen. So those piles, of course, are 3 inches high, 4 inches high. with an enormous kind of delicacy because their arrangement can be disturbed by the slightest movement or breath that would interrupt them. Going back to California, certainly one of your most celebrated pile artists here would be the late Chris Burden. I'm showing you the piece from Dallas in honor of Ike of all the submarines in the world, which he hung from so many strings and created a kind of levitating pile piece in the mid-1980s. And then coming right out of art school in London, one of the towering pile artists of the last 30 years, Damien Hirst, began by organizing his fellow Goldsmith students to have an exhibition in London called Freeze, to which a number of sort of bigwigs were invited, starting, a whole school of British painting. The image on the left of all the painted boxes sort of stuck on the wall is the piece that Hirst showed in that exhibition. And another one of his student works is this line of pots and pans. Here in Santa Barbara, where you have the wonderful video pile by Jun Paik, I just want to remind you of the piece that he did for the Olympics in Seoul, with over 1,000 television monuments turned into a tower, which I suppose is perhaps the most sublime of all the piles that we'll look at this morning. It's on display at the National Museum here. Straight out of art school, at the same time as the veteran Paik would be making his piece for the Olympics, Katie Nolan, the daughter of the painter, initiated her career at White Columns in New York with an installation of beer cans, which was quickly purchased by the Rubels, who made a private museum in Miami. And it has subsequently, this particular installation of these beer cans, been seen by so many people going every year to the Basel Miami Fair, that I think it sticks in our heads as one of the preeminent masterpieces of recent art. I stumbled upon this David Hammons at the Museum of Modern Art and couldn't resist adding that, where a pile of bottles and a pile of coal create an opportunity for him rather poetically to make an apostrophe to Night Train and the jazz legacy of the Harlem Renaissance. There's more of those to come. Here we are back to Alan McCollum, the man who made all of the little black paintings on the wall. Invited to show at the Carnegie International. He had plaster casts made of all the dinosaur bones at the Carnegie Natural History Museum next door, and then filled the atrium of the museum with this enormous mess of, if you like, of artifacts designed to stun us with their pileness, with their accumulation. Probably the most beloved of the piles has to do with the work of Felix Gonzalez Torres, who was himself a victim of AIDS and whose accumulation work really started in memory of his boyfriend, whose death preceded his, as he made works that were piles of wrapped candies to put on the floor, inviting visitors, if they wished, to have a candy and eat it, and then the owner would replenish the candies so that the pile would always maintain its shape. We're in the early 90s at this point. Here's another Gonzalez Torres piece where he's got, a group of light bulbs in a pile. Louise Bourgeois, who kind of makes an entrance into the genre every 20 years or so, did this beautiful cabinet now at the Guggenheim Museum filled with glassware, a kind of modern version, if you like, of the Sebastian Stusskopf still life that I adore. You can say I'm a sucker for a lot of glasses glistening all together, but so is Louise Bourgeois. Then going over to the British Isles again, we get Cornelia Parker, whose extremely successful practice, again, has been largely about expressing herself in varieties of piles. Neither from nor towards are the stones of a ruined building. I can't remember what catastrophe befell this building, but these are all, taken from it and then suspended. Her most famous pieces, and I couldn't resist showing the new director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art standing in front of one of them, come from buildings that were struck by lightning. This is from a church that was destroyed. It burned down when it was struck by lightning, and she accumulated the various pieces and hung them in this explosive array, which is a stunning a stunning sort of entry into the whole pile phenomenon. Meanwhile, Damien Hirst, I don't know whether one would say more or less poetic than his countrywoman Cornelia Parker, began to have enormous success with display cases of piles. In other words, taking a pile and then taking all of the individual little parts of it, no matter how meaningless they might be, and putting them into grand display cases. These are all cigarette butts. And the piece is about 20 foot wide. These sell from $15 to $25 million if you're lucky enough. And it enters into the genre of photography as well, with Tunics Work, inviting people who would pose to be in group photographs of nude bodies. This is the earliest one I think that he ever did at the United Nations in 1994. As we make our breakneck survey through pile art, we'll come back to larger ones. But it seems to me that even though this is performance art, it's still, and photography, it's still very much at bottom a kind of pile art. And he's not alone. I mean, no matter how sort of obscure, your take on something, it's going to be crowded in today's art world. I mean, it's very hard to do something where there aren't people doing what look, superficially at least, to be so similar in style. So the great performance pieces of Vanessa Beecroft showing nude young women in groups, it seems to me, are somehow a parallel to Tunics photographs. Here we are coming into California again with Mike Kelly's flatware pieces of, in this case it's buttons, a billion buttons that have been adhered to the surface of this large rectangle to have a presence with all of these parts working together that should be suggestive of, say the drip paintings of Jackson Pollock. Some of the artists, like Roxy Paine, with a certain amount of humor, decided that he could actually make a machine that would crank out pile art, and he would feed, wax and pigment into the machine that he would, and then run a conveyor belt underneath it, so that his Schumack sculptures, could go down an assembly line and into the gallery for display. Here's the initial iteration of the Dara Salcedo chairs piece that's done in Bogota to memorialize a political event where guerrillas stormed and took over the government, and all the empty chairs are meant to be mementos of the people who suffered that way. And then, to remind you, there's a little thumbnail of the piece that she recreating in Istanbul, 10 years afterwards. I just saw this at the Whitney Museum, Zoe Leonard. Again, I could have spoken for 10 or 15 minutes just on the kind of accumulations that have to do with self-portraits. There's in this case, Zoe Leonard decided that she would make a piece which would have a suitcase for every year of her life. She sold it to the Whitney Museum in New York with the understanding that she would add a suitcase for every one of her remaining years until the piece reached completion as a kind of numerical, objectified self-portrait of herself. There's another one of these on display in New York now in the Adrian Piper retrospective, where it's her nails that she clips off and her hair put into jars, where again she keeps doing that because the Museum of Modern Art bought the piece, and eventually they'll have a kind of, a self-portrait pile of the artist in the collection. Ai Weiwei, who has been such a remarkable and admirable voice for freedom and modern globalism, as an artist, is very, very much married to the pile aesthetic. It seems to me that they're almost numbing. So, like the stools that we saw right at the beginning when I made a bunch of the current chair piles, we'll see that throughout the 21st century, Ai Weiwei goes back to make piles of, various items. Here we have bicycles. Lullaby Season, Spring. This is one of 4 display cases, sort of like the ones with the cigarette butts, but these done with various painkiller pills, segregated to be appropriate for each season of the year. And I bring them in only because, not that there's any novelty in them, but the enthusiasm. I mean, to think that if one of these comes up at auction, the demand for it is mind-boggling. Hirst also has made a killing in works of art where he glues an infinite number of dead houseflies onto various black rectangles and circles, which are a 21st century, of course, iteration of the sponges and doll hands and crutches that we saw enter European art around 1960. You'd be surprised if nobody thought to make an allusion to the great burial sculptures of ancient China and Anthony Gormley, the great British sculptor. Indeed, in 2003, had people make an army of Chinese figures to have a miniature scale modernized version of this, celebrated work of art that was touring on exhibition everywhere. Hirst didn't stop at flies. He also did butterflies and created these absolutely gorgeous decorative works from, gluing down in an orderly fashion, thousands of specimen butterflies. For his retrospective, he asked the Tate Gallery to actually have a butterfly room so that people to appreciate, where his head was would be obliged to walk through a room that was crowded with the butterflies that you would see crowding his various accumulation paintings in the other galleries of the retrospective. It's international in scope now. I mean, it's gone global. When we began the story, we were talking about accumulations that were, in Europe and in North America. But by this point, thank goodness, the art world has become so globalized that now we see from Asia to Africa to South America that there are leading artists in every continent whose works are essentially grounded in the pile aesthetic. This is one of the early El Anatsui wall hangings made from the little metallic tabs that open cans. That the Metropolitan Museum has another one, but he grew out of making piles of cassava boxes and turning those into sort of figures. This was before he became a kind of international success with the bottle top or the can pull top wall hangings, which to me indicates that he, like so many of these artists from the 80s and the 90s, essentially was schooled in pile art. In other words, as they emerged as mature artists, they had gone through curriculum wherever they were in the world, which celebrated the avant-garde nature of pile art in the recent past and stimulated them to think about it as a mode of expression. Again, to come back to California, I was unable to omit the stacks of plates by Robert Tyrion. I just ran into some of these in London. I'll come back to that in a second. Here is William Cole's various shoe pieces, again about a decade old. Terry Atkins making another jazz piece out of a pile of drum cymbals, sort of like David Hammond's Night Train, this in honor of Charlie Parker. And then Roman Ondak, this is a great crowd pleaser. One of the things that, as pile culture has evolved, that I think has sustained it is the take something away, participate part, where you can actually interact with the pile. So Ondak made a piece where everybody who would come into the room was invited to mark their height against the wall, and of course, very, very quickly, the accumulation of the marks on the wall became a graphic entity in its own right that one could add to and participate with. To get back to Spencer Tunick, remember the United Nations nudes? Here we are in Mexico City in 2007, where, as you can see, the tunic idea was a huge success. I mean, I'm not Donald Trump, but judging from this picture, I would say the crowd has thousands of nude Mexicans who have come for the occasion to be in the photograph. A lot of them get to be political. Here's Vanessa Beecroft again, transforming her hallmark mode of nude mannequins, in this case African heritage Africans, into a performance splattered with red paint to represent the Darfur genocide. There's a lot of these that are at the Gagosian Gallery at this point. This is Dan Colin, one of the stars of the Gagosian stable, one of his bubblegum paintings, 53rd and 3rd from, again, 10 years ago, where, like Kelly with his buttons, in this case, they're chewed pieces of various kinds of bubblegum that have been adhered to the canvas to give an all-over abstract expressionist look. You all surely know this from your trips to Los Angeles, Chris Burden's latest and greatest accumulation sculpture there of all the lampposts outside of LACMA. One of my own personal favorites is Kohei Nawa's work, where he takes various animals that have been that have been preserved, and then covers them with little plastic spheres to create a kind of kaleidoscopic visibility to them as the surface becomes a kind of pile that has been poured over, a display of a different sort, so that you have to look through the pile to see the art. Here's some more examples of Subodh Gupta. You'll recall we looked at his piece for the Basel Art Fair at the beginning. Gupta's Spill, Gupta's This Is Not a Fountain. Here we are with El Anatsui again, the man who has delighted audiences worldwide with his can pull wall hangings. This is a mound of the tops of tin cans that he installed in Berlin at the National Gallery, in proximity not to Trajan's Column, but to a piece from the same era, to connect our modern vision with that of antiquity. Here's Ai Weiwei, who decided to make a pile of sunflower seeds, which was highly acclaimed to the extent that the Tate Gallery then invited him. These are not real sunflower seeds; they're made out of ceramic, and then the Tate decided to fill their entire huge entrance hall to the turbine hall with that piece as a follow-up a year later, so that people could essentially walk through or roll in the ceramic sunflower seeds, as if he were making a gesture to Ai Weiwei with his bicycle sculptures. Here's Dan Colin again in a recent Paris exhibition with a pile of bicycles in the backyard of the Gagosian Gallery that harks back to the pile of tires that Alan Capro put in Martha Jackson's yard back in 1961. And when invited to make a piece for the Brandt Foundation, a few years ago, Colin simply piled up all sorts of detritus to create a kind of sublime and, by now, just by association with such a long history of pile art, a kind of ultra-modern message and experience for visitors. Here's Ai Weiwei trying to respond to the horrible Chinese earthquakes by ordering truckloads of the reinforcement rods that failed to support the structures during the earthquake, and turning a pile of those into a memorial for the victims and the social stupidity that led to the tragedy. And here we go. Here's the shop window, if you like, of the Gagosian Gallery in London, with a Robert Tyrion piece on view, showing a pile of pots and pans, which indicates to me that we've come all the way from 1960, but in a way we haven't gotten anywhere. And so I paused and hope that this kind of redundancy in our aesthetics will receive closer attention and examination, and that what's become a cliche, which attracts some of our most prestigious artists. Sheila Hicks' great Venice Biennale piece from last year, for example, with piles of colored yarn, these big balls of them, that would somehow force a reconsideration of where we are in terms of piling on, and where do we go from here. I just cut this image out of a newspaper a year ago when I was, or a couple of months ago, I guess, when I was organizing this, and I saw all these reindeer skulls hanging up outside of the parliament as a protest in Norway. It's not a work of art, but it has the same impact. And I bring us back to Ron Muick's piece of skulls at the National Gallery in Melbourne, to remind you. And then, but 2 weeks ago at Frieze, New York, while we were wandering around, here was a dumpster full of stuff, of construction stuff, that was on sale at Frieze. And I'm not sure that the viewers, much less the artist, realize the extent of nostalgia involved by now in embracing let's call it a strategy of sculptural display that has been so long-standing. Thank you for your patience. Questions? Yes?
I'd be interested in how your reflections on what you think underlies or propels this popularity and prevalence of piling on art.
I'm stumped. I mean, if I have a pile in my house, I try to get rid of it. I really think that I mean, that's what intrigues me so much, is that because in art it barely appeared for so long, and then when it started, everyone just loved it, and we haven't stopped loving it. And I think that's important. I mean, I think that says something about us as individuals and us as a culture, but I'm not sure what. I mean,
I wonder if in art it's a reaction against or response corresponds to centuries of individual portrait painting or the still life, separate, carefully arranged objects that all have a kind of individuality. And I mean, that's just a suggestion, but history does tend to go in challenge and response. There's always going to be a reaction against what is gone. I don't know. I'm not an art historian. I don't know, but my impression is that, say, portraiture in 18th and 19th century was very big. And even early in the 20th, the careful still lifes and the abstraction are quite different from this piling on.
Right, but there is a thread. I think you're right. I mean, I think museums are essentially institutions of accumulation, and often they will have a room which is nothing but examples of the same sort of thing to be instructive, and it begins to have overtones of pilism, although it's not a pile. But yeah,
Day and age or so,
right,
with so many objects in the world.
right.
Consumer society.
I think that's a very big overtone is consumer culture, and the idea again, that sort of capitalist idea of showing inventories and displays of endless endless supply of the same product. That's certainly part of it, but it doesn't. It's an explanation that certainly doesn't work for everything that you saw this morning. Yeah. Are there other questions? Yes.
Where will this all go? How many things clever artists decide they want to pile up or accumulate?
I don't know. I mean, I think that anything that becomes a cliche, anything that becomes repetitive, is essentially academic, and I think that's what we've seen in my professional lifetime. I mean, when I started out in the 1960s, I would say that at least half of the artists that I met at this point had never gone to art school. They were outsiders and self-taught, but certainly by the end of the 1960s, it was pretty much de rigueur for an emerging artist to have studied at art school, and that's not just true in our country, but throughout the modern world. And so I think the ubiquity of piles has to do with a school mode, and we would call it academic if it was a kind of if it was a kind of prevalent painting that you would just associate with some other period. Yes, Ike.
That was a very intriguing sequence of images, and as always, you're so incisive in shedding light on something that should be obvious that people keep on missing, which of course is always significant in that it's a pressure point. What we don't see usually is of significance in a way we can't see until many years later. But it sort of seems to me also to bring up this whole point, which is so old and tired in a way, of originality.
Well, yeah.
And because in a way, this is a very significant and obvious example of a type of emulative strategy that is academic, and yet it's dressed up in a very postmodern idiom, which is industrial fabrication, the conceptual choice, right, and Duchamp. But doesn't that just sort of point to the failure then of the strategy in that it doesn't actually work anymore? I mean, it's become,
but it's
God forbid, decorative.
Yeah, to me, I for the last 10 years or so, when I see a pile work someplace, I always have a certain level of chagrin, thinking, oh, here's another one. But on the other hand, as you could see from the slides of the enormous works commissioned for various international art fairs, and how frequent the pile mode is appropriate to something on that gigantic scale, the end is not in sight. I mean, it almost seems as if we're in the heyday of pile art rather than in the twilight of it. I mean, I'm not sure that this will ever go away. And I'm not sure that there isn't something inherent in it that we should try to understand and grasp as an essential icon of who we are. There's only a little bit of me that thinks that way. Most of my seesaw goes towards the copycat side, but
what would its opposite look like? I mean, if you wanted to interrupt the cycle and make some sort of gesture defiant in refusing to participate in pile art, what would it look like?
I guess I guess that in the years, decades, that led up to the advent of pile art in the 1960s, most modern sculpture was framed as monolithic. The idea that there would be a whole, and that sculpture was able to present, a single entity with a kind of force, and there was I think there was a bias against modern art, advanced art, let's say in the early part of the 20th century, that frittered itself away with parts. And that this is kind of a revenge on that whole idea that one's going to come up with a unified thing, a Rothko or a Newman. But now you're going to have something that is, fundamentally about particles and parts, which will make a whole out of them, which will have its kind of, cake, ironic cake and eat it.
Does anybody else have?
If this is conceptual art, and I think it's to make us think, perhaps to reach emotions that we weren't quite sure we had inside of us.
Mm-hmm.
You've identified some possible ways that the audience might be triggered to engage with the art, such as piles from the Holocaust of skulls, or piles of consumer goods in a warehouse. So these are kinds of things that we might think of as we engage with the art in the museum. And yet, beyond those one or two, gee, that's interesting, and then beyond enjoying the visual beauty of the shapes themselves, what is there?
It's us. I mean, it's like a mirror, don't you think?
It's like, what?
It's I wish I had some sort of an answer to that. And people always, will ask me like, what's my point? And I don't really have a point other than to think that this would be an interesting thing to think about because it's so rampant.
Well, is Tom Wolfe right when he says it's all a sham and our house?
Poor Tom Wolfe. Yes, he was right more often than not, don't you think?
To tell them I question my own bias.
Well, I think that's probably it for now, but thank you so much for coming, and hopefully I'll see you in the fall.
Right. Thank you all very much.